Welcome back, everyone. Very warm welcome to this session. Now, a few housekeeping notes before we begin. You are in the consumer session. There is a concurrent panel on the energy system. So if you would prefer to be watching that and looking at our illustrious panel, who would? But please navigate to the industrial transformation stream if required. Now, we've had some questions from people already. Please do keep submitting your questions for our panel using the form below this window. So, joining me are speakers from ASEA, the RAC Foundation, IONITY, and the event partner for this panel, Auto Trader. Now, before I kick off the conversation, I'd like to share some pre-recorded insights from them all.
For EVs to convert the silent majority of car buyers, we probably need 5 things: great product choice, range, charging infrastructure, price, and simplicity.
We as industry are doing our best, and our wide range offer of plug-in hybrids, battery electric, and new Euro 6D engines are confirming our environmental commitments. Successfully moving into low and zero emission mobility must be a joint exercise between the industry, society, and the policymakers.
With an electric vehicle, you could find it's not only cheaper to run, it's more convenient too.
A uniform European charging standard, the CCS standard, is established and enables all sorts of power levels.
Availability of infrastructure and reasonable transition timeframe will also determine the overall cost of the transformation of our sector and affordability of our products.
2021 looks like being a year when a huge new variety of vehicles is going to come into the market.
So can EVs go mainstream so long as pricing remains higher than ICE and charging remains harder than refueling?
Great, thank you all. Right, let's kick on with the questions. So first up, Steve, Ian, a big question for you both. Steve, I'll take you first. How can we convert the silent majority of motorists out there into EV users?
I think the key to this is really not so much in converting them, in doing something that's a proactive thing like that. It's recognizing that people own cars, they drive cars because they're convenient, they fit their lifestyles. So the more that the industry is offering something that works and fits with people's lifestyles, the better. At the moment, people often say to me, are they really as cheap to run as people tell me? Are they convenient? How on earth would I get this thing charged? It is a difference from the cars that we're used to. But the more it becomes a mainstream thing, the idea being the more of us have got charging at home, charging conveniently, they talk to other people who are driving these vehicles and telling them, frankly, how good they are, that's going to build consumer confidence.
Thank you. And Ian?
Well, I think first it's worth recognising the scale of the challenge here. We're talking about changing decades of ingrained habits and reflexes about how we think about cars. And today I noted that the SMMT rightly called out the most ambitious industrial transformation in automotive history. Emphasis on industrial because we need to look at it also from the consumer point of view. We're talking about massive behavioural change, as Steve just highlighted. Now, our research consistently shows we had at least a positive start on this because right now 6 in 10 car buyers are considering a plug-in option within the next 5 years. So 6 in 10 is a silent majority. But to translate that consideration into sales, a lot still needs to happen. Choice and range are ramping up massively. So in particular, I'd call out 3 I's: greater incentives, investment in infrastructure, and clearer information. The single thing I think we can all do today to help consumers on the journey that Steve described is to provide them with clearer, simpler, relevant information to make an informed choice. Car buying, we know, isn't simple. EV car buying is even harder. The mass behavioural shifts won't happen unless we make it much simpler. So we need to help people understand that whilst upfront cost is high, total cost of ownership can be near parity with diesel or petrol. We need to lose the jargon around EVs, make them understandable in simple consumer language, and work harder to bust some myths. Don't even know that government grants are available. A quarter think EVs are more expensive to run than ICE. Another quarter believe they don't compare in terms of performance. So if we do all of that and overcome understandable concerns around cost and convenience, I believe that we can show that silent majority how they can challenge their own ingrained car ownership habits and see EVs as a viable option.
Thank you, Ian. The 3 I's, I like that. Now, Peter, one for you. What are the relative merits of the EU's broader approach to support decarbonisation versus the UK government's focus on promoting ZEVs, so zero-emission vehicles?
Well, I don't think that there's a broader discrepancy between the European policy and the one in the UK. I think that maybe it's just more PR about zero-emission vehicles, and of course a slightly, let's say, more ambitious target towards moving into fully battery electric vehicles in 2035, if not mistaken. But I think that anyhow, still there's a transition period up to that. And I think that this is the only difference where, of course, the European Union is looking in maybe a broader perspective how to also decarbonize the whole transport, because, of course, the focus in the zero-emission mobility for the passenger cars. But, of course, we need to have a look on the heavy-duty sector as well, which definitely cannot be fully zero and battery electric in that time frame. So I think this is the only difference where we have a look a little bit broader and, of course, take into account other elements. UK seems to me is focusing mostly on the passenger car zero emission mobility, but I think the directions are both the same in principle and with the same level of ambition.
Thank you. Now, Michael, where is the market in delivering the infrastructure, both from a continental Europe and UK perspective?
Well, first of all, I would say the good message is that the markets in the UK as well in the continental Europe are ready to scale. What we saw in the last years is really huge efforts going also not only into the vehicle delivery side and production side, but also in the infrastructure side, meaning high availability and more availability of infrastructure in all the different use cases. And as I said also in the clip in the beginning is, the good thing also is we have a European-wide standard, which is the combined charging system. That means looking 5-6 years to the past, where we were not really clear where is that standard really going. So we have a really, let's say, convincing arguments at our sides to say standard is there, no differences, everybody can use it, and let's just scale over the next year to really serve the upcoming demand, which we see coming.
Yeah, good point. Thank you. Peter, back to you for a moment. Can you tell us a bit about how Europe's addressing the big issue of affordability and charging infrastructure to encourage consumers to embrace EVs?
Well, I think that this is some kind of a puzzle. It is when we talk about a move towards electrified vehicles, it's not just a very single point that we have to target. I think this is also related to affordability and the charging infrastructure. So, of course, it's a mixture of policy measures on a European and national level, of course, still keeping subsidiarity in practice. So, of course, we do respect the differences. But, of course, there's a general European framework. We have 2 big pieces of legislation. One, of course, focusing on CO2 and through that incentivize, let's say, the market uptake of zero emission vehicles. And secondly, we have a regulation or directive for the moment on the alternative fuels infrastructure. So those are, let's say, the key instruments on a European level. But of course, it must be accompanied by the measures on the national level, where, of course, we feel the differences. That's absolutely clear. But I think that the vast majority of the member states are moving ahead with the rollout of the infrastructure. And of course, especially now through the COVID, we have a number of member states that have launched a number of so-called scrapping and fleet renewal schemes, which are, of course, focusing on the support of low and zero emission vehicles. So we are trying, let's say, to speed up the fleet renewal and through that also subsidizing, let's say, the electric cars, which, of course, we are coming back to the question of affordability. So again, it should go hand in hand and combination of different measures on the European and national level. That's the right way forward.
Thank you. Staying really with affordability, which is such a barrier to entry, as we know. Kind of 2 questions in one here for you, Ian and Steve. Firstly, how important is EV price and TCO parity? TCO, of course, total cost of ownership, which we know is a key factor in uptake. So how important are those parity with between EV and ICE? and a very topical one given everything that happened in the UK last week. What role for incentives? Ian, to you first.
Thanks, Erin. It's a challenging one, of course. I think we all know about the start point, the significant price gap that we often see at around 20 to 30% between an EV and its ICE equivalent. That gap narrows on a monthly payment basis with the combination of subsidised brand finance offers and government subsidies. But it is only when you factor in TCO that EVs get close to parity. And today, that logic works best for businesses who've already been thinking in terms of TCO for years. And that's no doubt helping business drivers lead the charge on EV take-up so far. Explaining TCO to private users won't be as quick or as simple, but we're going to need to do just that. Now, today's EV owners and also EV intenders that we can track on our platform tend to be much wealthier than the average car buyer. They're twice as likely to sit in the top income brackets. So without incentives to bridge today's price gap, we do risk running out of buyers able and willing to pay the green premium of EVs that will likely persist until OEMs can generate sufficient economies of scale and bring in lower cost battery technologies. But where incentives could really make an impact is in fact on younger used cars. Right now, this looks like quite a critical market failure. On average, EVs are still £10,000 more expensive when sold as sub 3-year-old cars compared to ICE. And even when you add in the TCO perspective, used EVs don't make financial sense until you get to 3-year-old cars. Crucially, though, forgetting ICE comparisons for a moment, nearly new EVs will actually cost more in most cases than when bought brand new because they lack 3 things: government subsidy, manufacturer support, and subsidised finance rates. That's simply not sustainable, so we'll be missing a trick if we don't generate equal demand for EVs when they hit the used car market. If we don't address that, values could fall, and then new EV sales either fall with them or cost considerably more, or both.
Thank you. Steve, anything to add?
Well, the thing I'd add, I agree with much of what Ian was saying, of course, but the thing I'd add is that, broadly speaking, in a pre-COVID year, the world of car buying falls into roughly equal components, and that's the fleet buyers that Ian's talked about and the private buyers. For the fleet buyers, these are people, there is nobody with a tighter focus on the bottom line than the operator of a fleet of vehicles. So what's really important for them is that total cost of ownership. And I would contrast that with the private buyers where, let's be honest, many of us are buying a vehicle with our heart as much as with our head. We might be thinking, what's this going to cost to run? But actually we're thinking, what is it we'd like to have? And I think it requires a subtly different approach to approach those two worlds. But I do think that somebody somewhere is going to have to take a bit of a hit on those second-hand values at some point. And I also think that one of the key aspects of familiarity with this new world of the battery electric vehicle is it's going to take some years for us all to be completely confident about how long the batteries are going to last. I remember the introduction of catalytic converters, and there were a lot of scare stories at the time that catalytic converters weren't going to last very long. They were going to cost an absolute fortune to replace. It was all going to be a disaster. Turned out not to be the case. I think we're all rather hoping that similarly here, battery life and battery replacement is not going to be such a huge issue in the second-hand market, and we can start to see more of those new vehicles trickling down into the more affordable parts of the market where many of us spend our time.
Thank you. Yeah. Now, Michael, to have a look at charging for a moment. IONITY obviously is focused on fast and super fast charging. So what's the gap that you're filling there?
Well, as you said, really the focus of IONITY is really to enable and having the freedom for the end customer to travel long distance across Europe. Yeah, meaning across dedicated country, meaning the UK, for example, but also going cross country. So we're there in 24 countries live and scaling up. And I think from the consumer perspective, by traveling long distance really is, where's the availability? So is there a holistic network available for me? So having the freedom and really can rely on such a network to go on these long trips. The second one is really the accessibility. Am I able to access this network? So in our case, for sure, the end customer is always 24/7 able to access it and pay on site, but also we are connected with more than 100 mobility service providers, so meaning charge card providers, that enables you to use our network across Europe, settled perfectly together with a, let's say, customer service that you can approach also in 7 languages. So in case you might have a question or there is anything, you can give a call and you will receive the help necessary. And I think that's really also the key point, not only in our use case on the long distance, but it's the same for each and every other use case in the city or in semi-private, let's say, charging conditions to provide the end customer really these benefits.
Yes, thank you. I think it's fascinating, isn't it, how we see range anxiety increasingly changing to charge anxiety and what an integral part charging is to the whole process. Thank you. Ian, back to you. What do your forecasts of the rate of uptake of alternatively fueled vehicles and EVs tell you about their effect overall on the park?
Well, first of all, if you look at today's trajectory, the trend is positive. Supply of new and used EVs on our platform is up more than 200% year on year. Demand for EVs is roughly double prior year. And we can all see that new plug-in sales have exceeded diesel in each of the past 3 months. But firstly, we expect that trend to continue with AFVs ahead of diesel through 2021. Then by the middle of the decade, where most forecasters also crucially expect EV ICE price parity that we've already talked about, there we expect plug-in sales to surpass petrol and diesel sales combined. Through to the end of the decade, it's likely those cars will still form part of the mix, though, as both a necessary source of profit for OEMs and a relevant preferred choice, if you like, for many drivers, no doubt, particularly also outside of cities. But we assume that by the time we get to 2030, EVs will have clearly become the preferred mainstream choice, and that this shift won't have dampened the overall market size. Crucial point, of course. But it's important to bear in mind that even at that 2030 point, to your question, where we only sell, obviously, new plugins at that moment, they'll only weigh around 40% of the park. Therefore, around 19 to 20 million ICE cars will still be on UK roads. When you consider that today, 17% of people are telling us in surveys that they don't envisage buying an EV even within the next 10 years, and that new car life cycles are well in excess of 10 years and growing, we're likely to still see plenty of petrol and some diesel models on UK roads, I think, well into the 2040s.
Thank you. Now, Steve, to go back to you, you've already touched on this quite a lot, so I don't know if there's more that you want to add in here. I've got a question here about fleet and used vehicles. And obviously, you've touched on that when you talked with Ian about total cost of ownership a bit, but is there anything else you want to say about fleet and used?
Well, I think there is a conundrum here for government, which is the fact that in order to continue to provide incentives for the purchase of new vehicles, you're talking about providing money to the sort of people, let's be honest, like me, who might well be financially in a position to buy a new vehicle, which is by far and away not many of us in this country. Many of us have never bought a new car and would certainly never be buying some of the more expensive electric options that are coming through. And I think, really, I have to say to government here, you've got to be a bit brave here. Unless you're able to pull through those vehicles that are in the, let's say, the 30 to 50,000 pound bracket and start to see those trickle into the second-hand market, they're never going to get there. So yes, you're going to be providing a subsidy for people who are quite possibly in professional jobs, reasonably well paid. How is that going to be helping the country to level up? How is that helping lower income households? And the answer is, it's helping them 3 to 5 years down the line. Because if those vehicles are never bought in the first place, they're never going to get into the second-hand market. And those of us who live in the second-hand market are never going to have access to them. So be brave, be a bit bold, keep that going. The other thing I'd say about incentives is, and I've said this to the guys in government, I've said it to the Department for Transport, I think that the one grant that I preserve, if all of the others came under pressure from the Treasury, is to get more and more of us to have home charge points fitted. New buildings, new homes should all be coming with charge points fitted. Apartment blocks and designated parking spaces, that's where we need them, because it's in those places where we're going to find the EV the most convenient and the most open door to push on.
Thank you. And actually, that leads really nicely into our first audience question from Adam from CGI to the panel. whilst they are more reliable, things do go wrong with electric vehicles, I imagine he's talking about, with limited ability to fix EVs at the roadside, particularly battery issues. How is the industry focusing on the next generation of support options to give consumers the confidence that they are capable of long road journeys? Michael, long road journeys, super fast charging, all that sort of stuff. You could talk perhaps a little bit about giving consumers the confidence.
Well, first of all, saying if you look at our sites on the long distance, especially around the highways, it's not just one charge point, it's many charge points, meaning it's not the availability of the network alone, it's really the availability on site as well. The second thing is, as I mentioned before, by knowing that there might issues come up and people ask for help, we set up this international, let's say, customer service, including 7 languages. That means if you from the UK go down to Spain, or me from Germany going up to France, I get served in my language, and I also can follow, let's say, the information on the display in the right language I want to choose, to provide really that confidence that also Ian and Steve mentioned to the customers. That's the best we can do. That's what we are offering today already, and that's but something we need to see in the full open network, right? Not only in ours, but for all networks, for the consumers.
Thank you. One here for you, Ian. Richard Perry from NatWest. How do the panels see the industry managing the RV challenge on both ICE and EVs? Are the manufacturers staring into a financial abyss?
Well, I think I touched on some of those points earlier regarding the issue around nearly new EV vehicles in particular. Without the government support and without a manufacturer subsidy, which you usually find in the form of a dealer contribution, a deposit contribution, I beg your pardon, and usually supported APRs and so on, there's this noticeable price gap. They're more expensive than new cars. That can't last. So I think it's vital that manufacturers support the late plate, if you like, the nearly new, call it what you will, those EVs that end up in the sub 1 year category in particular. When they end up in the retail parks and so on, they need financial support. If the government can't put it behind there, then if the manufacturers don't, they will end up with an RV problem further down the road.
Thank you. Steve, one here for you, I think, from Anges from Which EV on fuel tax. The Exchequer will need to recoup the missing revenue from ICE vehicles, of course. Does the panel think that fuel tax will increase exponentially from 2025 to 2030, potentially seeing a £2 to £3 a litre price at the pumps, ensuring tax revenue remains high?
Well, I think the short answer to that is no, from my perspective. And I say that because we have seen the original, the fuel duty escalator, frozen for many, many years now. And the reason it's been frozen is it is a very hot political potato. Now, I can well believe that Rishi Sunak might be sitting there thinking, it's about time I started putting duty rates up for petrol and diesel vehicles, but he's going to face quite a backlash. And as Ian's been saying, we're going to have a lot of petrol and diesel cars running around well into the 2030s, into the late 2030s, quite possibly by that stage quite old vehicles, not terribly expensive vehicles, the sort of vehicles that are run by people in low-income households who are just trying to get through the week. And the government doesn't want to be penalising them. So I'm not sure that we're going to see any kind of massive, huge ramping up on that front. There is a question for the Chancellor, which is, does he need to replace fuel duty with a different form of tax or duty on motoring? If he answers that question yes, then I think what we should actually be debating is, well, what's that going to look like for the zero tailpipe vehicle? And is that going to be some sort of mileage charge, which many people are advocating? And if so, how exactly is that going to work?
Thank you. Peter, perhaps one that you could take a look at here from Andrew at LexisNexis. Now, we know battery leasing, Renault, we know, had a consumer proposition where the battery was leased. I know Ian spent a lot of time at Renault and we'll have a view on this, but we'll try Peter first. Was this a benefit and was something that should be revisited? What do you think, Peter, about battery leasing in general for OEMs?
That's a good question. I think that's the case of Renault and I don't know now the name, that was in Israel already 10 years ago with the battery swapping system. This shows that, okay, we as industry are trying, let's say, to invent whatever solution, how to make the TCO and affordability of electric cars closer and closer to the wishes of the customers. So definitely, I think that we will see in the future different options, how to make, let's say, the cars cheaper. And of course, we all know that the battery, it's a critical element of the EV, especially talking about the second-hand market, which was here very often cited. This is a question mark. Let's be very frank. And let's say the residual value of the battery is something that, of course, is of a concern for the consumers and for the businesses, and has an impact on the TCOs. So I'm pretty sure that this will not be, let's say, the last attempt how to do that. Of course, it will be up to individual manufacturers to think and find possible ways how to approach the customers and tackle those issues. And as I said, we are trying whatever, how to, let's say, put this barrier or question mark away and make it clarity for the consumers.
There's quite a lot of questions coming in here on batteries, but maybe time for just one more here. A question here from Philip at Cox Automotive. Is the aftermarket sector ready in terms of knowledge and skills for the inevitable increase of electric vehicles in the market? Ian, any thoughts on that?
I think the NFDA has a highly commendable program called the EVA, which certifies the retailers that have gone through audited training for both sales and after sales. I think that's a scheme that has government support, but not enough, and it really needs a ramp up to be able to spread its scope much more broadly, to give reassurance to the consumer, but obviously to give that reassurance based on audited quality standard and so on, which we do need to improve. The skill level, that we are talking about technicians, not fitters, I think, in the future, and only that. So it will need a significant ramp up in the years to come.
Thank you. Crikey, how time flies when you're having fun. I think that's all we've got time for on this session. I'd like to thank all 4 panelists for participating. A little bit of housekeeping again. We're going to take a couple of minutes to ensure that the concurrent panel has concluded, and to allow people to change streams as desired. Oh no, hold on, we're back up and running after technical problems. We're extending the session. Woo! To 2 o'clock, so we've got another 10 minutes of fun. Let's find some more questions in that case, because there were plenty. The panel will be chuffed to know.
Just while you're having a look at that, Erin, can I add to what Ian was saying a moment ago to your last question? So I think there are 2 aspects to it. I think it's a really perceptive point. One is, I think, about the technical skills. And it's great there are some initiatives running on that front, and that's really important, and they'll play out, and that's good. The other, I think, is also, I did a little bit of mystery shopping myself in this market a while ago, and I think we need the sales teams also to develop their understanding of the products that are now coming through. I found that, not to put too fine a point on it, I knew rather more about the vehicle I was looking at than the person who was trying to sell it to me. And that doesn't build great confidence. So I think there's a push on both fronts there. There's a technical capability. Hopefully these vehicles are going to be easier to look after in the future with fewer moving parts, but also a sales capability. And that comes right up front to the initial sales when you're just having a browse around and thinking, shall I buy this model or that one? You need to be talking to somebody who really knows their stuff.
Yeah, fair point. Thank you very much. Here's a good one from Laura Save Bennett. I hope I've pronounced it correctly. At Urban Science. Michael, one for you, I think. The availability of charging points is key to the uptake of EVs. The reality is that this availability will be a bigger challenge in rural areas where public transports are fewer. Should there be a drive to install EV charging points in rural areas to ensure rural populations are not left out of the future mobility landscape?
Short answer, yes. That's the difference of the difference we also see from research is that especially in the more rural areas, people are more having, let's say, access to smaller charging options, meaning really a garage on site where you can recharge your vehicle while staying at home, which might be much more difficult than the big cities. Just thinking of the biggest one in London, for example, where literally nobody has a space where he can park his car, and using public transport. But also here, the people need to have the access and the assurance that charging infrastructure is available. So if there are, let's say, the initiatives, and also using, let's say, the hotspots where the people are in the rural areas anyway, like having the big shopping malls where people spend, let's say, the daily time there, and ramping up the infrastructure there is also a good option to start with the full network density across the country.
Thank you. And Steve, has the RSC Foundation published a report on this?
Well, what we did was publish a report last year about the experience of driving around the Scottish coastline, the North Coast 500. And what we found is some very rural communities where having an electric car actually was a positive advantage. And it's well worth looking at what the Scottish government has done here, because for people living in remote areas, actually the supply of conventional fuels can be quite awkward and quite expensive. Having an electric vehicle, if you're perhaps routinely only doing 30 or 40 mile trips, could actually be very convenient, much cheaper to run, and the public network, of course, in Scotland is extensive and free at the point of use. So a lot's been done to encourage people there, and I think it rather surprised us that actually an EV can be in many ways a better solution, particularly, as we've said, for those people with off-street parking in a rural area, than in a built-up area where lots of Victorian and Edwardian terraces mean that off-street parking is very rare and at a premium when you get it.
Erin, can I just add to that point? I mean, to Petr's and Steve's comments. I mean, I'm the city dweller living in a terrace in London, like you described. So that off-street parking is a necessity. So I think we need two things really. A lot of the street-based parking solutions that Steve talked about earlier, massive adoption is required through things like the lamppost charging systems that are available now. But beyond that, I think we all need, whether we're rural or city dwellers, we need the charging solutions to be available on the routes we take for longer distances, along the highways and the motorways and so on. Because if you consider that either I charge on my street or a rural dweller charges at home, maybe we both charge also at our office or workplace, that's not going to be the problem for most people's day-to-day journeys. It's when I do my odd 200-300 mile journey where I need to be confident I pull off the motorway and I don't wait a few hours to find an available charging post.
A question for Steve and Ian come from Neville Jackson at the Advanced Propulsion Centre. Fuel taxes, which we briefly touched on, currently provide a substantial income stream for the government. How will this income be maintained in an EV-dominated vehicle park, and how might this affect total cost of ownership? Steve?
Well, I think the first question, as I said a few moments ago, for the Chancellor is it appropriate that motorists should have to pay a tax simply for the privilege of motoring? There are reasons why I think he'll decide the answer to that is yes. But I think there are ways of thinking about some form of distance charging for electric vehicles. The important things for me are, if that's going to happen, the government needs to be clear with us. At the moment, we're being invited to buy vehicles on a particular calculation of how much they're going to cost us to run. And the government needs to be upfront about this. If we're going to have to pay the equivalent of fuel duty, even if we're buying an electric car, well, how's that going to work? How much is it likely to be? If it's going to be a distance charge, I could see that working. But I would say to government, let's be honest. Let's say from a date, and let's say what the date is, you're going to have to chip into the exchequer just like you did before in your ICE car. This is how we're planning the system's going to work. And frankly, it's going to be quite dull, no more exciting than fuel duty, but it's going to give us a revenue stream and it's going to pay for things that benefit us all, not just spending on roads, of course, but schools and hospitals too.
Thank you. Ian, if you don't mind, I won't come to you just because I'd rather try and get through a few more questions from other people in the 3 minutes that we have left to us. One from Fergus Clark at UKBIC. Once the introduction of EVs is in full flow, what do you see the government doing to deal with the huge number of petrol and diesel vehicles being scrapped? Ian, do you have thoughts on that, maybe?
I don't think there will be a lot of vehicles being scrapped any more so than they are currently being scrapped. Steve's talked about it, I think, very eloquently. A lot of people are driving older cars today for a very simple reason, which is that they're cheaper and that's what they can afford, or that's at least the amount of money that they want to be able to put into car ownership, or as opposed to other discretionary purchases that they might want to prioritise. So that will remain the case. There will be older petrol and diesel vehicles. We'll start getting, thankfully, some older hybrids and electric as well, and they'll become more available as the tranches of age and therefore price bucket which we buy those cars become sort of broader. So I think we could accelerate the scrappage rate. We could accelerate the renewal of the whole of the UK car park and so on if the government wanted to really make a bolder move. We've used that word a few times. That could be something that we could emulate from the likes of France, who not only have an incentive on EVs, but also a scrappage incentive to encourage the older cars in particular off the roads. And it's those the oldest cars that I think we should be focusing our minds on rather than assuming there's going to be a general boost of scrappage numbers.
Thank you. Time for one more, probably. Petr, perhaps for you here, one from Abhishek Sampath at Delta E. Your thoughts on end-of-life directive with respect to responsible battery recycling?
Well, I think it's not only about recycling, but of course there are a huge discussion ongoing about the second life of the battery, especially for the energy sector. Let's say the packs of batteries for the grid stabilization, etc. I think this is just an ongoing discussion how, let's say, facilitate the life for us. Let's be very frank, because really the demands from a regulatory perspective on the batteries are enormous, and of course we are lacking from a certain perspective the batteries for the smart grid stabilization and the functionality of a decentralized grid. So I think that this goes hand in hand, and it's exactly now the very in-depth discussion we are having with the institutions, how to, of course, fulfill all requirements, but also being enabler also for other industries that are heavily, let's say, asking our used batteries for second life.
Thank you. Right, now I think this is all we've got time for. Who knows, we might get another 10 minutes in a second. So thank you once again to everyone.